Emily Carter stood in line at the gray line border checkpoint, her worn backpack resting at her feet. The air was thick with impatience, the typical hum of travelers all waiting for their turn to be processed. Around her, people fidgeted, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting from the guards to their watches. It was an ordinary scene, the kind that played out at hundreds of checkpoints every day. Emily blended in seamlessly, a face in the crowd, nothing remarkable about her at all. Her clothes were simple, bought on sale at discount stores, and the backpack was nothing more than a basic hiking bag, well worn from years of use. She wasn't a tourist, though no one would know that. No one could tell the difference between her and any other person making their way across the border. The guards, moving methodically through the crowd, glanced over faces in an almost mechanical way. Emily was just another name on a list of travelers. They didn't know her past, didn't know the significance of the simple items in her bag, or the experiences that had shaped the woman standing quietly among them. She was invisible to them, as invisible as any other person in line. The checkpoint was efficient, but there was a distinct coldness to the atmosphere. The security officers stood rigid, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning the crowd as they worked. The hum of radios mixed with the clicking of pens on clipboards. A few of the officers made casual conversation among themselves, talking about lunch plans or the weather. No one spoke to the travelers. The rules were clear, the procedure routine. The guards moved with precision, each action carried out as though it were part of a well-rehearsed dance. The sound of a bag being zipped open here, the shuffle of papers there, the low murmur of commands, all these things blended into a steady rhythm. Travelers stepped forward when called, hands raised, brief moments of interaction before they were waved through. Continuing on their way, the entire scene felt mechanical. There was no urgency, no excitement, just the mundane motion of people moving through a checkpoint. But there was something about Emily that set her apart. Not in any obvious way, not at first glance. She wasn't drawing attention to herself. But if anyone had bothered to look closely, they might have seen the way she held herself. The stillness of her gaze, her calm. She was no rookie traveler, no nervous tourist fidgeting or looking around. Emily was different. Even in this ordinary setting, there was something unspoken, something about her that didn't belong in the crowd. Yet, for the moment, she was just another traveler, just another person carrying a backpack through a border checkpoint. As the minutes passed, Emily's mind remained focused. Though the crowd around her continued to shift and murmur, there was a rhythm to waiting, and she had learned long ago how to settle into that rhythm. The guards continued their work, indifferent to the passengers they processed. They didn't know who was standing among them, didn't know that this ordinary woman, with her quiet demeanor, had once been someone they would never have expected. For now, she was invisible to them, just as she had chosen to be. She had learned the art of blending in, the necessity of remaining unnoticed. But she also knew, deep down, that her invisibility wouldn't last forever. The checkpoint was just the beginning. And so, in the midst of a world of travelers, Emily stood silently, just another face in the crowd. The mundane routine continued around her. But there was more to her story than anyone could guess. It wasn't visible yet, not to the guards or anyone else around her. But something was about to shift. The question was when, not if. And in that quiet anticipation, something unexpected was about to unfold. Emily stepped forward when her name was called, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes on her as the guards began to scan the crowd again. Her calm, deliberate movements contrasted sharply with the chaos and impatience that rippled through the line of travelers behind her. She placed her worn backpack on the inspection table without a word, her gaze flicking briefly to the lead guard, who eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and routine indifference. The moment felt like any other border checkpoint interaction, distant, almost mechanical. But there was something about it that Emily couldn't shake. She knew the risk. It was a dangerous path to choose, but sometimes it was the only path available. The lead guard, a tall man with a sharp face and an attitude to match, spoke with a clipped tone, asking her to empty her bag. His voice carried an edge, like someone used to exerting control over others. Emily didn't respond, her expression neutral, her body language calm but alert. As the guard began pulling out the first few items, she could already feel the tension building in the air around her, a palpable pressure that was hard to ignore. The other guards watched the exchange with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. She wasn't the first traveler to be checked that day, but something about her, something quiet and unremarkable, made them take extra notice. One of the guards, a young woman with sharp eyes and a mocking smile, pulled out a tactical knife, holding it up for the others to see. She chuckled, the sound dripping with sarcasm. Well, this is a serious camping tool for someone on a tourist trip. she remarked, running her finger along the blade. Her comment was loud enough for the growing crowd behind them to hear, and Emily could feel their eyes on her. The female guard's voice was tinged with disdain. But Emily didn't flinch. She simply stood still, her expression giving nothing away. Another guard, this one older and more grizzled, pulled out a coil of paracord, holding it up with a raised eyebrow. "What's this for?" "Then some sort of survival show," he asked, his tone teasing but laced with the suggestion that he already knew the answer. Emily's eyes flicked to the item in his hand, and a faint, almost imperceptible sigh passed her lips. She was used to this kind of mockery. It wasn't new. She'd endured worse in her military days, from both enemies and allies. This, however, felt different. It was invasive, personal in a way that felt wrong. But there was no way to explain herself without making it worse. The younger guard, eager to add her own comment, picked up a small, portable water filter. "Oh, so you think carrying all this gear makes you some sort of expert?" she asked, clearly amused by the array of items she was unpacking. The laughter from the surrounding guards and a few onlookers added to the tension, the judgment in their eyes almost tangible. Emily didn't respond. She simply let them talk, her silence like a barrier they couldn't breach. The mocking words didn't break her resolve. But the stares, the subtle hum of disapproval in the air, she felt. Each item that came out of her bag, the small, efficient medical kit, the compass, the water purification tablets added fuel to their ridicule. Emily didn't bother explaining. In her experience, explanations made it worse, especially when people had already decided you were guilty of something. She had learned long ago that the most effective way to handle this was with silence, with stillness. Her mind, however, was anything but still. It was cataloging, processing, scanning every exit, every possible escape route. Her years of training kicked in, and though her face remained a mask, her senses were fully alert. She was preparing for the worst, just in case. The lead guard, having now pulled out most of her gear, gave her a long, piercing look. He was enjoying the moment, relishing the power he had in this situation. "Planning a little camping trip, are we? Or maybe starting a revolution?" he quipped, his voice dripping with condescension. The other guards chuckled. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag, but otherwise, she remained unmoving. The tension was thick now. The crowd around them, a mix of travelers who were either quietly grateful they weren't the ones being searched or who were watching with growing curiosity. Emily could feel their eyes, some pitying, some amused, all of them thinking they knew exactly what she was, a woman pretending to be someone she wasn't, a tourist playing soldier. But what they didn't know, what they could never know, was that the gear in her bag wasn't just for show. Each item had been carefully chosen, not for convenience, but for survival. She had lived in places where her equipment had been the only thing standing between her and death. The tactical knife wasn't for cutting through the jungle vines. It was for cutting through the chaos of a hostage rescue. The paracord wasn't for camping. It was for constructing makeshift barriers and tying up hostile combatants when the situation called for it. The water filter wasn't for a backpacking trip. It was for drinking water in places where the alternative could kill you. They had no idea. The female officer, still holding the paracord, looked at her with a mocking grin. "Let me guess," she continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think carrying Boy Scout gear makes you tough?" Emily's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't surprised by the insult, nor was she upset by it. It was just part of the game. She had played it countless times before, with far higher stakes than this. In the military, she had faced enemies who underestimated her, who had seen only her gender, not the strength beneath it. The problem with that was they had never lived to regret it. As the guard continued to inspect her things, Emily's mind drifted for a moment. The memories flickered through her of sand and blood, of hostage rescues in foreign lands, of moments when failure would have meant death, not just for her, but for others. The weight of responsibility had been heavy then. It was heavy now, too, in its own way. But there was no time for those thoughts. The inspection was still ongoing. The guards were still poking through her belongings, still mocking her. Then, just as Emily thought the worst was over, the lead guard's hand moved to a small, hidden compartment in the bag, a space she had carefully sewn into the lining. His fingers found the zipper, and she stiffened imperceptibly. This wasn't the first time her bag had been searched, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this felt different. The guard's fingers moved with a practiced, methodical touch, a touch that spoke of years of experience in finding things that shouldn't be there. When he finally pulled out what he'd been searching for, Emily felt the world around her tighten, as though the air had become too thin to breathe. In the officer's hand was a small silver trident, the Navy SEAL trident, the badge that had defined her, the symbol of everything she had sacrificed and fought for. For a moment, the world seemed to go quiet. The guards, the crowd, the buzz of radios, all of it faded into the background. The lead guard held the trident in the air, and for the first time, the atmosphere at the checkpoint shifted. The laughter died down, and even the radio seemed to fall silent. The tension in the air became so thick, it was almost suffocating. The guard stared at the trident, his expression slowly morphing from disbelief to confusion, then to awe. The other guards crowded in, their eyes wide as they recognized what it was. Emily felt their gaze shift, but she didn't move. She didn't say a word. Not yet. The moment the lead guard's fingers brushed the hidden compartment in Emily's bag, she felt the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The movement was slow, deliberate. As the guard's experienced hands found the concealed zipper, for a brief second, Emily's heart skipped, but she didn't move, her gaze steady as ever. It was too late now. Whatever happened next, she would face with the same calm resolve that had carried her through so many impossible situations. The guard's fingers worked the zipper open with precision. The small compartment in her bag was a well-kept secret, a hidden space she had sewn herself for moments like this. The seconds stretched long, painfully slow. As the lead guard pulled out an object wrapped in cloth, the crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something was about to change, something far beyond the usual routine of a random security check. When the cloth fell away, the silver gleam of the Navy SEAL trident emerged into the harsh fluorescent light. The eagle, the anchor, the trident, all unmistakable, all symbols of sacrifice, duty, and a life that Emily had carefully left behind. The air around them froze. It was as if time itself had stalled. The guard who held the trident looked down at it, his expression shifting from amusement to something he couldn't quite place. His brow furrowed, eyes scanning the badge, processing its meaning. The atmosphere around the checkpoint changed instantly. The mocking tone of the guards faded away, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to swallow up the sounds of the bustling border, the faint hum of radios, the shuffle of feet on the floor. Everything seemed muted, as if the weight of the discovery had cast a heavy veil over the scene. Onlookers, once casually watching the inspection, now stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged quick glances, their earlier amusement replaced by confusion. Others looked at Emily with renewed curiosity, as if they were seeing her for the first time. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle, though her mind raced. She was no stranger to being underestimated, but this moment the sudden shift from casual mockery to real recognition was something she hadn't expected. The guards, their voices silenced by the badge in their hands, began to exchange looks. The once disdainful guard who had held up her tactical knife now stood beside the lead guard, his face betraying a mix of disbelief and recognition. "You're not serious." The younger female officer's voice broke the silence, her words almost a whisper. As she stepped forward to peer at the trident, it was clear from her expression that she was trying to reconcile the woman. She had been mocking with the symbol she now saw in front of her. The trident, something that no one who wasn't part of that world would ever fully comprehend, had changed everything. The harsh laughter that had once filled the air now felt like a distant memory. The lead guard slowly lowered the trident, still staring at it, as if waiting for the badge to reveal more than what it already had. The realization hit him before his words could form. His posture straightened, and for the first time, his demeanor shifted from mockery to something approaching awe. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, laced with uncertainty. "Ma'am," he said, his tone less commanding now, almost deferential. His gaze flicked from the trident to Emily's face, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the elite soldier she had once been. "Nobody told us. Nobody said a SEAL was crossing today." A ripple of murmurs passed through the guards and the small crowd of onlookers. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. The trident wasn't just a symbol, it was a testament to something deeper, something that demanded respect. The officers who had previously been so sure of themselves now found themselves uncertain, hesitant. The power dynamics had shifted. What had been a routine check was now something else entirely. The female officer who had mocked Emily just moments ago stood stock still, her expression cycling through a range of emotions. First, confusion, then recognition, and finally, a strange mix of shame and awe. Her eyes never left the badge in the lead guard's hand, and for the first time, Emily saw her falter. The energy in the checkpoint had completely transformed. The tension, once sharp and mocking, now felt heavy and respectful. The eyes of the guards, once filled with derision, now betrayed a new understanding. Emily's calmness in the face of their reaction was almost palpable. She knew the trident had power, but she hadn't expected this immediate shift. Her heart, steady as it had always been, felt the weight of the situation. She had earned that badge long ago through trials and sacrifices. But this moment, this quiet recognition from the very people who had mocked her was something new. The trident, now exposed, did more than just reveal her past. It was making her something they hadn't prepared for a person who commanded. More than just respect, it commanded awe. The lead guard stepped back slightly, almost as if the trident were too powerful for him to hold. He looked around at his colleagues, his face a mask of confusion, and then back at Emily, searching for some sign that this was all some kind of mistake. But Emily stood silent, her gaze unwavering. She had known this moment would come. She had carried the trident as both a shield and a burden. It was a piece of her history, one she couldn't shed, even if she wanted to. The crowd of onlookers, who had been murmuring amongst themselves, now stood in complete silence. Some were still processing what had just unfolded. Others had begun to piece together the significance of the trident. It was clear now that Emily wasn't just another traveler. She was someone who had lived a life that most could only imagine. Someone whose actions had shaped the world in ways few would ever fully understand. But for now, the truth hung in the air like a secret, one that no amount of mockery or casual conversation could undo. Emily, for her part, remained still, allowing the guards and onlookers to come to their own conclusions. The truth was out there now, and she had no need to explain herself. The badge spoke for her, louder than any words could. She had earned it through sacrifices that would never be written in history, books, and now it had done the talking for her. As the tension in the air began to settle, Emily could feel the shift happening around her. The guards were no longer just checking her bag. They were looking at her differently, as if seeing her for the first time. The trident had revealed her past, and with it, had silenced the mockery and derision. Now, all that remained was a quiet respect. But it wasn't just the guards who had changed. Emily herself had transformed from an invisible traveler into someone whose presence could no longer be ignored. The lead guard stood frozen, still holding the Navy SEAL trident in his hand, staring down at the symbol that had just shattered the routine of the checkpoint. His confusion was palpable, but it didn't take long for the gravity of the situation to set in. As if on cue, a senior officer, a man with salt and pepper hair and a face weathered by experience, stepped forward. His presence was commanding, but not overbearing, as if the air around him seemed to sharpen with focus the moment he entered. The scene, he scanned the room, and the moment his eyes fell on the trident, he shifted his gaze back to Emily, assessing her with a careful, calculating look. "Step aside," the senior officer said, his voice firm but calm. His words weren't a command, but more of an instruction, a professional redirection. The other guards instinctively moved aside, making room for him. And for the first time in the entire exchange, Emily felt the weight of authority settle on her like a protective mantle. It wasn't the mocking authority of the younger guards. It was the kind of respect that came from someone who had been through the rigors of command, someone who understood what it meant to question the unspoken realities of the situation. The senior officer didn't look at her with any hint of accusation, only a steady, unwavering gaze that seemed to see right through her, past the simple woman standing there, and into the truth she had left buried for so long. He gestured for the trident, and the lead guard, still holding it, slowly passed it into his hands. The moment it left the lead guard's grip, the entire atmosphere seemed to shift. No longer was there a sense of casual mockery. Instead, there was an air of reverence, something that made Emily stand straighter, though she showed no outward sign of it. "Ma'am," the senior officer began, his voice quieter now, as he assessed the trident carefully. "We'll need to verify your credentials." He glanced back at Emily, his eyes flickering with recognition. "For protocol," he added, though the word felt like a formality in this context. Emily's response was measured, her voice calm and clear as she nodded slightly. She knew what was coming, and she had prepared herself for this moment. She had always been ready to answer, even though the questions that would follow were more dangerous than the mockery she'd just endured. With a practiced precision that matched the senior officer's, Emily spoke without hesitation. "Serial number Alpha 779 Charlie Delta 04. The numbers slipped from her lips like an instinct, but the weight of them was immense. The officer's eyes flicked up to meet hers, briefly narrowing, as though understanding the magnitude of what she had just stated. It wasn't a random string of digits. Those numbers were part of a history that had been buried, erased from official records, and never spoken aloud in public. It was the kind of information that only someone who had been deep inside the military's most secretive operations would know. The senior officer didn't flinch at the response. He simply nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. He had no need to ask her why she knew that number. He had already recognized the weight of it. With a subtle gesture, he signaled to one of the other guards, who immediately moved to initiate a secure military communication line. Operation Nightfall, Emily continued, her tone unwavering. Operation Desert Ghost. Operation Broken Arrow. She recited the names of operations, each one classified above the clearance level of anyone in the room. They were operations that had never been acknowledged in public, their very existence concealed by layers of government secrecy. But Emily had lived them. She had survived them. And now, with every word, she revealed a piece of the woman she had once been, the woman that the guards had so carelessly mocked moments before. The senior officer's eyes widened, but only slightly, betraying the tiniest hint of shock. He had known enough to understand what those operation names meant, even if they weren't public knowledge. The magnitude of the situation became clear in that brief, silent exchange. The young guards, still processing the shift in the atmosphere, stood motionless, their earlier bravado slipping away as they began to realize who they were dealing with. No longer was Emily just the tourist they had ridiculed. She was someone far more, someone whose presence in the room had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. The radio crackled to life, and the senior officer's hand moved to pick up the receiver with deliberate care. The conversation on the other end of the line was quiet, but urgent. Emily didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. The verification process was already underway, and she could feel the shift in the guards around her. Their postures had changed, no longer stiff with mockery but relaxed, almost deferential. Even the younger guards, who had once sneered at her, now avoided her gaze, their faces flushed with the realization that they had misjudged her entirely. As the senior officer spoke into the receiver, his voice low and professional, Emily remained as she had throughout the entire encounter, composed, patient, and still, she had faced far more dangerous situations, had stood in far more hostile environments, and yet, in this moment, there was a strange sense of power in her silence. She knew exactly how this would unfold. The guards might not have understood who she was before, but now, they would. They would understand that there was more to a person than what they showed on the surface, more than just the clothes they wore or the way they carried themselves. They would understand that true strength didn't announce itself. It simply existed, quietly, unassumingly, until it could no longer be contained. The conversation on the radio grew more urgent, the senior officer listening intently as he received the verification. His expression was unreadable, his eyes focused on the officer at the other end of the line. The tension in the checkpoint seemed to have reached a breaking point. The guards around her had stopped moving, and the only sound was the occasional crackle from the radio and the steady, rhythmic sound of the senior officer's breathing. Emily felt it all, the weight of their gaze, the shifting power dynamic, but she never let it show. She had long since learned how to be invisible when necessary, how to disappear into the background, and yet in this moment, she was anything but invisible. She was the center of their world, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not. When the senior officer finally placed the receiver back down, there was no need for further words. The guards, who had once looked at her with derision, now regarded her with a sense of respect, no longer mocking, no longer judging. They had seen the truth. They understood now who she was, who they had underestimated, and who they had mocked. And that understanding was enough. There would be no more jokes, no more taunts. Emily's eyes met the senior officer's one last time, and in that brief exchange, she saw the quiet acknowledgement that her presence demanded. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. The guards around her stood a little straighter now, no longer looking down on her, but seeing her for what she truly was, a woman who had lived a life beyond their comprehension, a woman whose strength could not be measured by the size of her gear or the simplicity of her appearance. The senior officer spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a final, respectful decision. "Your credentials have been verified. Ma'am, you're cleared for immediate passage." There was no further inspection required, no questions asked. The shift in the air, from suspicion to respect, was complete. Emily took a deep breath, her calm demeanor never wavering, and moved forward. The lead guard, still holding the trident, took a step back, his expression shifting. For a moment, The entire checkpoint was silent, as though the air itself had become too thin to carry sound. He looked from the trident to Emily, his eyes narrowing in something that resembled regret, though he said nothing. His fingers tightened slightly around the silver badge, as if processing the significance of what he had just uncovered. The mocking tone that had once been so sharp now seemed distant, erased by the weight of the realization. "Ma'am," he finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. He shifted his stance, his shoulders less rigid than before. His gaze, which had once been filled with disdain, was now filled with a form of hesitant respect. I didn't know," he added, his words trailing off as if he wasn't quite sure how to finish the sentence. The other guards, still gathered in the vicinity, exchanged glances, some uneasy, others embarrassed. The younger ones stood motionless, a quiet discomfort spreading through the air. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her to be more than what they had assumed. Emily, for her part, didn't respond. She remained still, her expression unreadable, her body language calm and neutral. There was no need for her to speak, no need to explain herself further. The truth had already been revealed, and it spoke volumes louder than any apology could. She accepted the moment in silence, understanding that her actions, her past, were now undeniable, but she would not engage further. There was no satisfaction in it for her. This moment, awkward as it was, wasn't for her to claim. It was for them to understand. As the senior officer looked on, the dynamic around Emily began to shift more visibly. The younger guards, who had once mocked her silently, now stepped back, their heads slightly bowed in a gesture that wasn't just of respect, but of reflection. They seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the person they had so easily dismissed was someone they could never fully comprehend. They were young, eager to prove themselves, perhaps a little too quick to assume that someone like Emily, someone who didn't stand out in the ways they expected, was insignificant. But now, standing in her quiet presence, they saw the truth. They had been wrong. The older guards, too, showed signs of internal conflict. They were the ones who had seen more, who had perhaps learned humility over the years. But now they were faced with the quiet lesson that no amount of rank, no amount of experience could have prepared them for. They looked at Emily not with fear, but with something else understanding. The same understanding that the senior officer had already processed. The understanding that strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek recognition. It simply exists. The senior officer, still holding the trident, met Emily's eyes for the first time since the moment of recognition. His gaze was steady, no longer questioning or critical, but something else acknowledging. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a weight of sincerity that hadn't been there before. "We didn't know who we were dealing with." He paused, almost as if testing the weight of his own words. There was no bravado, no attempt to cover up his earlier mistake, just an admission, quiet and genuine. Emily didn't need to respond. She could feel the shift in the air around her, feel the guards' growing respect in the silence that enveloped them. They weren't mocking her now. They were processing what had just happened, and more importantly, how they had misunderstood her. The transformation was almost imperceptible, but powerful nonetheless. Emily had not asked for this change, had not tried to elicit respect. But in the quiet aftermath of the reveal, it was evident that respect had come to her in ways that words could not describe. The atmosphere in the checkpoint, which had been tense with mockery just moments before, was now heavy with something different reflection. The younger guards who had once made snide comments now stood with their heads, bowed slightly, as if absorbing a lesson they hadn't expected to learn. The older officers, too, seemed to shift their weight in a way that suggested deep thought. They were the ones who had seen the worst and the best in the world, and yet, in this moment, they had learned something new. They had learned that real strength doesn't announce itself with loud boasts or showy displays. It is the strength that remains quiet, that endures in silence. As the apology settled into the air, Emily did not let herself feel vindicated. There was no sense of triumph in her, only the quiet understanding that the truth had been revealed. She wasn't there for recognition, nor for the apology that had now been offered. She was there simply to pass through, to move on with her life. The apology was theirs to give and theirs to feel. She had nothing more to say. The senior officer, after a brief, respectful pause, motioned for Emily to continue. "You're cleared for passage," he said, his tone respectful, his voice steady now that the truth had been acknowledged. The guards around him stepped back, parting like the sea, their earlier discomfort replaced with a subtle, almost reverent quiet. The checkpoint had changed in a matter of moments. and the guards had begun to realize the depth of the mistake they had made. Emily didn't hesitate. She picked up her bag with calm efficiency, the trident still in her mind but no longer in her possession. She slung it over her shoulder, her movements smooth and practiced. She didn't need to prove anything to them. She had already proven it through her silence, her endurance, and now, her quiet acceptance of the apology offered to her. As she moved toward the exit, the guards who had once treated her with condescension now stood still, watching her go with a new understanding. Some avoided her gaze, some simply nodded, but all of them knew that something had shifted in them. They would not forget this encounter, not because they had been humiliated or because they had been taught a lesson, but because they had witnessed something. Rare a person who had earned their respect without asking for it. The checkpoint, once filled with tension and mockery, had transformed. The guards, once smug in their assumptions, had begun to learn the true meaning of humility. They had learned that respect must be earned, not through displays of power, but through quiet strength and dignity. Emily had taught them that lesson, not with words, but with the simple truth of who she was. As the door to the checkpoint closed behind her, Emily was already walking away, her past once again locked away in silence. But this time, not without its recognition. The world had seen her for a moment, and in that moment, something had changed, not just for her, but for them. The aftermath of Emily's brief appearance at the checkpoint spread like ripples in a pond, quiet but undeniable. Within hours, the story was circulating through military channels, whispered in break rooms and passed from one soldier to another. Emily had become an unofficial legend, a symbol of strength and resilience that no one could ignore. Her actions, simple and quiet as they were, had left an indelible mark on the checkpoint staff, one that would not easily fade. The female officer who had once mocked Emily, the one who had dismissed her as a mere tourist, resigned from her post within 3 days. Her resignation letter, though citing personal reasons, was understood by everyone who had witnessed the incident. She couldn't continue in her position knowing that she had insulted someone who had earned more than she could ever understand. It was a quiet decision, made in the shadows of regret, but it spoke volumes about the shift in perspective that had taken place. New training protocols were swiftly put in place at the checkpoint. The supervisors recognized that the guards needed to learn how to approach each traveler with more consideration and respect, no matter their appearance. The goal was no longer to simply conduct efficient checks, but to ensure that every person, regardless of their status or background, was treated with dignity. The training sessions focused on humility, on understanding that respect should be given freely, not earned through power or authority. It was a small change, perhaps, but it was one that would ripple outward, influencing the way the checkpoint operated moving forward. The guards who had once mocked Emily found themselves looking inward, reflecting on their actions and the assumptions they had made. They began to approach their work with a new sense of respect, each person recognizing that they could no longer rely on their preconceived notions to guide their behavior. The younger guards, in particular, seemed to absorb the lesson with surprising speed. They had learned the hard way that strength wasn't always visible, that the quietest among them might carry the most weight. As the days passed, they worked with more patience, more attention to the people they encountered. They had seen the truth, and it had changed them. The older guards, who had perhaps seen more of the world and its harsh realities, found themselves reflecting on their own journeys. They had learned long ago not to make assumptions, but even they had fallen into the trap of judgment. Emily's presence at the checkpoint had reminded them that their experience, though valuable, was not all-encompassing. They had been humbled, not by their own mistakes, but by the quiet strength that had passed through their checkpoint without fanfare or recognition. It was a lesson they would carry with them long after Emily's departure. As the story of the encounter spread through the military community, Wingding Estafi Mao, it took on the qualities of a legend. The details shifted as stories often do, but the core truth remained the same. Emily had been someone who had earned respect without ever demanding it. She had reminded them all that strength didn't need to be broadcasted. It didn't need to be validated by words or actions. It was enough to simply be who she was, to carry herself with quiet dignity, and to allow others to see the truth of who she had been without saying a word. In the days and weeks that followed, Emily's story became a topic of conversation among military personnel, both veterans and newcomers alike. They spoke of her in hushed tones, sharing what little they knew of the woman who had walked through the checkpoint, and in doing so, had altered the course of their thinking. Some speculated on her past, wondering what kind of missions she had been involved in, what dangers she had faced. Others simply marveled at her poise, her ability to remain calm and composed under pressure. The military community had a new, silent hero in their midst, someone whose actions had transcended the need for recognition. Conversations among soldiers now reflected a shift in attitude. They talked more about the quiet warriors they had encountered in their lives, those who didn't seek glory or acknowledgement, but simply went about their work with determination and courage. Emily had shown them that it wasn't always the loudest person in the room who commanded the most respect. Sometimes, the quietest people had the deepest stories to tell. Her brief appearance had given them a new perspective on what it meant to be a hero, and they carried that lesson forward in their own lives. As for the checkpoint staff, the impact of Emily's visit lingered long after she had passed through. The new training protocols, though a small step, were a tangible reminder of the change she had brought about. The guards who had once been so quick to judge now took their time with each traveler, offering respect where it was due, and learning to recognize that everyone had a story. They could never fully understand at first glance. It was a humbling shift, one that would stay with them for years to come. Emily herself, of course, was long gone by then, her trail already fading into the past. No one knew where she had gone after the checkpoint, or why she had been traveling in the first place. Her story remained a mystery, and perhaps that was part of her legacy. She had reminded the world, not through her words but through her presence, that true strength wasn't about being seen. It was about carrying on, quietly, steadily, and letting your actions speak for themselves. In the end, her legacy lived on in the subtle changes that had occurred in the guards' attitudes, in the way they now approached their work, and in the quiet respect they offered to every traveler who passed through. Their checkpoint, Emily's brief appearance, had caused a ripple, one that had turned into a wave of change. And though the world would never truly know who she was, the people who had witnessed that shift would carry her lesson with them, always. The checkpoint became a place where travelers felt a little more seen, a little more understood. The guards, once rigid in their ways, now looked at every person who passed through with a more thoughtful gaze, remembering the quiet woman who had taught them all the true meaning of strength. And somewhere, in the whispers of military circles, Emily's story was passed on, a legend in the making, reminding everyone who heard it that true heroes serve in silence. As Emily walked away from the checkpoint, the crowd of guards and military personnel parted silently to let her pass. Her movements were unhurried, almost casual, but the weight of the moment was not lost on anyone watching her. There was no fanfare, no acknowledgement of the shift she had caused. She hadn't sought recognition, yet the respect had come to her, quietly, without her needing to ask. She was simply moving on, leaving behind an atmosphere that would never be the same again. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself was more powerful than any victory cry could have been. The guards, once so quick to mock, stood still, their eyes fixed on her retreating figure. Their thoughts were their own, but in the stillness of the moment, there was a collective sense of understanding that hadn't existed before. They had seen Emily for who she truly was, not just the quiet woman in the line, but a woman who had earned something that most of them would never fully understand. And in that recognition, there was both humility and awe. They had learned a lesson in strength and respect that they would carry with them forever. As Emily reached the exit, she paused for a moment, turning back just enough to catch the gaze of the lead guard, the one who had mocked her the most. Their eyes met, but there was no anger in hers, only quiet acknowledgement. Without a word, she offered him a brief nod, a silent understanding between them. It was all she needed to say. The guard, still holding the trident in his hand, nodded back, but his posture had softened. The mockery was gone, replaced by something deeper, an unspoken respect that had been earned in the silence between them. "You weren't supposed to know," she said quietly, the words barely audible, but enough to carry the weight of the truth behind them. It wasn't a statement of arrogance or triumph. It was simply a reflection of the life she had led, the choices she had made, and the role she had taken in a world that hadn't asked her to be a hero. But in this moment, she knew that the truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. The words hung in the air for a brief moment before she turned and walked out, her figure blending into the distance. For those left behind, the checkpoint seemed to lose some of its edge, some of its earlier tension. The guards who had stood around her now stood in quiet reflection. The female officer who had mocked Emily just days earlier had left, her resignation hanging like a shadow in the hallway of the checkpoint. It was clear to everyone that something had changed, and though it was subtle, the shift was profound. As the days passed, the atmosphere at the checkpoint shifted further. The guards, once impatient and dismissive, now approached their work with more thoughtfulness. They took more time with each traveler, considering the lives and stories of the people they checked. There was less suspicion in their eyes, less judgment in their tone. The lesson that Emily had imparted wasn't one of anger or defiance. It was one of quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand attention, but earned it through the weight of its presence. It was a change that could not be undone, no matter how many passengers passed through the checkpoint in the future. Among the military personnel, Emily's story spread, whispered in corners and passed along from one soldier to another. It became a story that wasn't about a great battle or a heroic deed in the traditional sense. It was about the strength of someone who had quietly endured, who had carried the weight of the world on their shoulders without asking for anyone to notice. It became a story of humility, of recognizing that true strength doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it walks quietly through a checkpoint, unnoticed by most, but leaving an impression that lasts long after it's gone. Emily had taught them that heroes don't always seek validation. True strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It exists quietly, with the weight of its actions speaking louder than any boast or show of force. And in that quiet, in the stillness of her walk through the checkpoint, she had shown them that. She had reminded them all that the greatest acts of courage and honor are often those that go unseen by the world, and that the most profound lessons are sometimes the ones we learn in silence. Her absence became a reminder to the guards, and to everyone who had witnessed the shift she brought with her. They would carry the lesson of that day with them forever. That true strength comes not from what you display, but from what you carry inside. It was a lesson they would pass on to others, a lesson learned not from words, but from actions. As Emily disappeared into the distance, her story had already begun to fade into legend. It wasn't the kind of story that would be written in history books or shared on the news. But for those who had been there, it would remain a quiet truth, a reminder of the unseen heroes in the world and the strength they carry in silence. Real strength doesn't seek applause. It simply is.